Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. Welcome to our weekly Chair Chat. I'm Juan Thomas, Chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. And today I come to you from Washington, D.C., because tomorrow we are kicking off our ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Economic Justice Summit at Georgetown's Law Center. And I'm so excited for everyone who's been a sponsor, who's agreed to attend, and all of the people throughout the section, the leaders of the bar who've participated to make this event come alive for tomorrow. And so we are so excited to have one of those leaders in our section, in our bar, Antonia Fasanelli, who is the executive director of the National Homeless Law Center, and she's also the co-chair of our section's Economic Justice Committee. I'm so glad to have Antonia with us today, who's been a leader and one of our main participants in planning this summit that's coming up on tomorrow. Antonia, welcome and hello.
Thank you, Juan. I'm so delighted to be here and so excited for the summit starting tomorrow.
We are so glad that you are with us and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I wanted to kick off our conversation by just kind of asking you to respond to kind of generally your thoughts about the role this year of the theme that we've played, that we've highlighted around economic justice.
Well, Juan, I really have to thank you for your commitment to addressing economic justice through the American Bar Association. You know, we want our listeners to know this was the topic you selected for your bar year, and it's really been our honor to be able to support that vision, all of us in the Economic Justice Committee, to support that vision and to elevate many critical issues of economic injustice going on within the United States. And
Right.
we're going to be able to highlight so many of those issues through the two-day economic summit starting tomorrow. So I really want to thank you for your visionary leadership in focusing on this year.
I want to thank you again also, because I remember the discussion you and I had in California last spring for our spring meeting when we first started talking about this. And you went back and put together a detailed agenda. A lot of that we've incorporated into our final agenda. And so you really helped lay the groundwork, gave us the blueprint on how to put this conference together. So I'm forever grateful to you specifically for all that you did to help make this happen. So thank you. Tomorrow, we're going to kick off our summit with a keynote address from Congressman Al Green of Texas. Congressman Green is a lifelong champion of civil rights and social justice issues, and he will be discussing our conscience agenda, which will consist of pieces of legislation dedicated to aiding and abetting the elimination of invidious discrimination around the United States. There are specific bills that he's been focused on, specifically the Slavery Remembrance Day Act, the Congressional Gold Medal for Americans enslaved, and also he wants to rename, interestingly enough, the Richard Russell Building, which is one of the buildings on the Senate side of the Senate. So he's going to be coming tomorrow to speak with us about those bills and just generally how lawyers can be more impactful and engaged on issues of civil rights and social justice, and specifically for economic justice.
Juan, that's so exciting. And what a fantastic speaker in Congressman Green to kick off this two-day summit. And honing in on what lawyers can do to address economic inequality. What an exciting way to start. I'm so looking forward to his speech. Yeah,
I am too. And after his speech, you'll be leading a panel discussion on guaranteed income. And you do a lot of work around that issue. Could you kind of give us some highlights as to what that panel will be discussing and the broader impact of that issue?
Absolutely. I'm so excited for these two panels. focused on the topic of guaranteed income. But let's just set the stage for a moment. I think it bears repeating, though we have all heard it before, that in the United States, economic inequality is at an all-time high. The U.S. Census Bureau itself last year reported that that income inequality had increased in 2021 for the first time in 10 years. The pandemic certainly contributed to it, but we were on a course of significant economic inequality already. A few other things to keep in mind. Hourly productivity in this country has increased by over 60% since 1979, but the pay for workers has only increased by about 18%. So this widening productivity pay gap is contributing to the inability of so many households to be able to afford their basic life necessities: housing, transportation, food, other issues like that. Minimum wage has not kept pace. My colleagues at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition analyze this every year. There is no county in the country where the minimum wage enables a family to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And so it unquestionably, economic inequality is one of the major issues contributing to poverty, marginalization, and ultimately oppression in our society. And I'm so grateful, again, that you've created the space for us to talk about this. So one of the major ways that policymakers are attempting to address this widening economic gap is through guaranteed income programs. Sometimes these are known as universal basic income, but they're essentially programs that have been launched as a pilot basis to provide cash supports on a monthly basis to a select population, and then study the impact of those cash payments on that particular population. Those programs have been widely successful in being able to move families and individuals closer to and over the poverty line in many cases, to help them afford those basic life necessities that have become out of reach, to pay for medical care, and as I said, housing and transportation in order to get to jobs, et cetera. These are really critical programs, and I'm so glad we're going to be able to highlight many of them. So for the first panel, we're going to be talking about what is guaranteed income from a policy perspective and from an implementation perspective. We're really lucky to be able to have someone from the Mayors for Guaranteed Income speaking about this. This is the national program set up supporting mayors all over the country who have launched guaranteed income programs. And it's worth noting that there are over 100 cities now that actually operate guaranteed income programs. So this is the national organization studying this and working with those mayors. And we're so glad to be able to have Tiffany Bradley, who's the public engagement director, speak to this. We're also delighted to have Peggy Bailey from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities speaking to this as a policy matter. She's really an expert. She's the Vice President for Housing and Income Security. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to say about this. And then to round out that first panel, we have two speakers, both from programs administering guaranteed income programs. One is in Baltimore, Maryland. That's Robin McKinney from the Cash Campaign of Maryland. And the other is in Jackson, Mississippi. Aisha Nyandoro from the Magnolia Mothers Trust. So yes. Delighted to be able to hear the on-the-ground information from them on what they're going to be covering. And then the second panel is really going to be talking about how do we take these pilot initiatives and turn them into sustainable policy? I know you know this, but for our speakers, the American Bar Association adopted a policy commitment to the human right to basic income in 2019 and is urging all governments, federal down to local governments and tribal governments, all to have policies to provide enough income for people to be able to survive. So turning this from pilot initiatives into sustainable policy is so critical to being able to make this happen. We're really delighted on that panel to be able to have folks from the Jane Family Institute, the University of Pennsylvania Center for Guaranteed Income, the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, and then someone who just recently left the White House and worked on the American Rescue Plan there. And really delighted to, just such a great list of speakers on that panel to be able to discuss that topic. So really glad we can devote 2 sessions to this really critical issue. I think it's going to be such a substantive conversation.
We can't wait to hear more. And like you said, income for so many people is one of the foundational pieces of how they begin to build wealth, or in order to buy a home, pay for their kids' education, take care of their daily needs. And so this topic is so critically important, and to get a broader understanding of it is critically important for lawyers and policymakers who may need to consider implementing these strategies in their particular locale. So thank you for leading that conversation on tomorrow. After that, we're going to have a luncheon speaker, the interim executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. Elaine Carr will be joining us to talk about the work that the center's doing. And I just want to highlight again, we are so grateful to Georgetown's Law School, Peter Edelman, the dean who will be speaking tomorrow, Janelle George. All of them have been so tremendously helpful in not only hosting us, but giving us this platform to discuss these important issues. And Georgetown has done a great deal of work in dealing with some of the economic justice issues in the context of their own campus and the history of how Georgetown was built by former enslaved Africans. And so I'm appreciative to all of the Georgetown family, and I'll make sure I send one of my nephews or nieces to Georgetown when they get up. It's time to go to college. I don't have children, so can't do kids. But seriously, we're grateful for that conversation. Looking forward to hearing interim executive director Carr tomorrow during that conversation. And then in the afternoon, we're going to continue our conversation with another panel. We'll be discussing taxes and debt. Debt is a fundamental problem for so many people. And of course, understanding our tax policy is also another important issue that we'll be discussing. So we're looking forward to an afternoon conversation around taxes and debt, the Uniform Debt Collection Default Judgments Act. And that panel will be led by Caitlin Wolf, who is the Legislative Program Director and of the Uniform Law Commission and the Vice Chair of our Economic Justice Committee here for the Civil Rights and Social Justice section. She'll be leading a very important discussion with a group of panelists. And then after that discussion will lead into another panel discussion around hot topics in taxes and debt. Some of those panelists include Xavier Braza, Frank Clement, Catherine Menifee, and Kate Welbeck. The earlier panel will be led with Judith Fox, Raymond Pepe, David Reed, and Erica Ricard. And so we're looking forward to those people being part of that discussion. And what I really want to highlight about these panels, we've done so much work to make sure we find the subject matter experts and the people who can really speak to the substantive policy issues. If we had time to give you their bios on this chair chat, we would, but it's a chat, not a speech or a lecture. So we're not going to do that during this time, but please look up those names. I do want to mention also that this summit will be held virtually as well and recorded for people to view later. But I'm so excited. After our first day, we're having a reception that's being sponsored in part by the DC Bar Foundation. We're so grateful for the DC Bar Foundation, who's partnered with us. I have many friends and colleagues who've been part of that bar. I'm sure you do too, and Antonia. So we're happy to not only have them as a sponsor, but as our reception speaker. Dorothy Brown, who is a professor of law at Georgetown, will be speaking. And of course, she's the author of The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax Code Has Impacted Black America. She wrote that book came back out, I believe, in 2021. And so we're so excited that she'll be joining us. And again, a subject matter expert, someone who understands these issues and can help educate and enlighten the audience around what we can be doing as lawyers with respect to tax policy, because tax policy is often codified by the IRS code and also state and local taxes as well. So looking forward to that conversation. So that's day one, a full day of uniform conversations around these issues. Looking forward to it. Anything else you want to add on about day one?
No, except I'm so excited for that entire day. I think it's going to be really such a fantastic set of conversations.
Yeah.
So I'll be glad to start off day two. I know you're excited, and I'm excited too, that the American Bar Association president, Deborah Enix Ross, is going to be kicking off day two. And we're just delighted to have her support and her involvement in this. I know she's been supportive of your leadership, and it's really just great to be able to have her there. She is, of course, an attorney at the firm of Debevoise and Plimpton. Really delighted to have her there. And then she's followed by more excellent speakers that I know you'll speak to, Juan.
So after our president speaks, and again, you're so right, I've been so lucky this year to have a president that we could collaborate with and work with. She actually did our first chair chat. She was my first guest. We kicked off these chair chats last August. We're also going to have tomorrow, after Deborah Enix Ross, Charles Lowry, who's the president-elect of the DC Bar and is senior policy director at the National Housing Conference. Looking forward to his conversation. And after that, Zikta Martinez is speaking, who's the deputy director of the U.S. Commerce Financial Protection Bureau. And so again, these are some heavyweight speakers, some people that know these subjects intimately. And so we're going to be talking to Director Martinez about consumer protection issues and policy around financial protection and ways that we can be engaged again as lawyers to be more up to speed on those issues. After that.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I was going to say for sure. And hearing from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is so critical to these conversations for sure. So I'll take it from you there. We're so delighted to follow that up with a panel speaking to environmental justice, redlining, and the housing crisis. Now, you cannot talk about economic injustice without talking about the housing crisis. And so this is going to be a really exciting panel. They're going to be talking about the long-term impacts of redlining on community development, housing, education, and of course, economic justice broadly. We're really delighted to have Margot Brown from the Environmental Defense Fund, Marianne Engelman-Lado, who is with the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Charles Lee from the EPA as well, and Quentin Pear, who's a professor at Howard University School of Law and is on the American Bar Association's Task Force on Environmental Justice. And Gwen Keyes-Fleming with DLA Piper is going to be moderating that panel. It's going to be really exciting, and I'm so excited to hear it. I can't wait. And then that session is going to be followed by a session that you are participating in, Juan.
Yeah. So after that, we're going to be having a video discussion, or airing a video discussion that I had with Dr. Derek Hamilton, who is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School in New York. And he's also the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. He and I had a fascinating conversation around racial equity and justice issues, and tying these issues back to the broader discussion around economic justice. So please tune in to that discussion on Friday. Dr. Hamilton is a phenomenal thought leader and expert on issues of racial justice and race in the economy and racial equity. He's also on President Biden's Treasury Advisory Committee, and he wanted me to let everybody know that he is speaking in his personal capacity during this conversation, not on behalf of the Biden administration. And then after that, that'll lead us into our panel on racial justice and economics. That panel will be moderated by a friend of mine, Professor Justin Hansford, who's the professor of law at Howard University. He's also the executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at the law school at Howard. And so he's agreed to moderate this panel. And we've got a discussion with Brian Gilmore, who is the senior lecturer at the MLAW programs, University of Maryland. Will Schooley, who's the past chair of our section. He's coming to speak as well. And he's an attorney with the San Diego Volunteer Lawyers Program. And Curry Shelby, who's a professor of law at the Washington and Lee University's Law School in Virginia. And so that'll be a very interesting discussion that will then lead us into our luncheon keynote speaker. Do you want to talk about our luncheon keynote speaker?
I absolutely will. And before I do, I will tell you that panel is going to be excellent. Brian Gilmore is a former colleague of mine from the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. And I'm so delighted that he's on this panel with other wonderful colleagues. I think it's going to be a great discussion.
Absolutely.
And yes, following that panel is going to be a fantastic keynote presentation by another wonderful longtime colleague of mine, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, Demetria McCain. This is so exciting. We're so delighted that Deputy Assistant Secretary McCain is able to join us. She is truly an expert in housing, and particularly fair housing. Before she went to HUD, she was the director of the Inclusive Communities Project in Dallas, Texas, a critically important fair housing organization, running a mobility program, helping families move out of communities of poverty and racial concentration into more communities with more opportunity for each family. And before that, she was at the National Housing Law Project. So delighted she can speak particularly to fair housing and housing opportunity under the Biden administration. It's a very exciting lunchtime keynote.
Looking forward to hearing her.
Yes, yes. And then you have the last panel, yeah?
Yeah, so after lunch, we're gonna have our final conversation. We're not gonna keep people too long on a Friday afternoon on a wonderful, hopefully spring day in Washington. But we wanna end our discussion on Friday with a discussion around where do we go from here? That's the title of our last panel. I'll be moderating that panel. On that panel will be not only Peter Edelman from Georgetown's Law School, but also Kira Jarrett, who's an old friend of mine. And she's the executive director of the DC Bar Foundation. And then a new friend of ours who's been active with us this year, Stuart Yazar, who is the leadership group member for the economic architecture of, and so we're looking forward to being with all three of them to really frame the discussion around where do we go from here? What can lawyers specifically do? One thing that I've wanted to do this year, and I've stressed throughout the year, we just don't want to talk about these problems. We want to be part of the solution. And so we're looking for concrete action items that lawyers can do, that the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section can be part of, and the larger American Bar Association, and perhaps even the legal community generally, should and can be doing to address these economic inequities that continue to plague our society, locally, throughout the country, and even globally. And so that discussion will be hopefully fruitful, but also substantive, because we're looking for answers to what do we do after Friday? What do we do after the conference is over? We'd like to be able to report back either throughout the next several months or the next few bar years to tangible things that our section did to advocate, to promote policy changes, to introduce new policy ideas, to work with GAO, that is our Governmental Affairs Office at the ABA, to promote policy, but also to engage other entities within the ABA and the legal community, such as your organization and others. How can the ABA be a partner? How can we be part of the solution? And so we're looking forward to that conversation on Friday afternoon. That'll conclude our two-day summit, which for me has been hopefully the highlight of the year. It was, like you said at the beginning, that was our vision when we started off this bar year. And so I'm so excited that it's finally all coming together. You and the entire, what we call our volunteer leaders, have been so helpful. And of course, our staff, we'll thank them throughout the week, but I do want to thank Paula, Ali, and Rachika, who staff our section, for all of the work they've done throughout the year, particularly over the last several weeks. The way they've been able to coordinate and the details it takes to put together a conference are often overwhelming to those of us who don't do that every day. But without Paula, Ali, and Rachika, I would be a fish out of water. And so forever grateful for them and for you, for all of us, all of our section leaders in the Economic Justice Committee, also, who've been very critical in the planning and meeting to put this conference together.
It's been our pleasure. And let's make sure before we wrap up that we let folks know that they can still register for the summit to view it virtually.
Right.
The in-person registration is now closed, but if you want to attend virtually, attend one or many of the panels we've discussed, you can go to americanbar.org/CRSJ, stands for Civil Rights and Social Justice, CRSJ, and it's right there on the homepage, the Economic Justice Summit. You can register to attend virtually. And I know, Juan, you want to acknowledge some of the other sponsors of this summit. You mentioned Georgetown University Law Center. We can't say it enough. We're so grateful to them and the DC Bar and the DC Bar Foundation, but we also have the support of Truist, the American Tax Policy Institute, the ABA section of taxation, the Hip Hop Caucus, Francine Littman, our colleague Francine Littman, and James Williamson, and Gwendolyn Keys Fleming. Thank you all. We're so excited to be with you over the next 2 days.
We're so grateful for all of our sponsors. And not only has registration closed, it closed because we're at capacity.
Yes.
We are at the number that Georgetown can't hold anybody else. So we are excited and hope everyone who registered shows up and participates in this important conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for the vision.
All right. We will see you all tomorrow. If you are in Washington and if you've pre-registered, please join us tomorrow, bright and early. We start at 8 o'clock Eastern time for breakfast. We'll kick off our discussions around 8:30, 8:45, and we will see you tomorrow at Georgetown's Law Center. Have a good evening.
Good evening, everyone.